My grandparents' 60-year marriage was the definition of perfect, until a strange woman and her children appeared at my grandfather's funeral, claiming a connection that shattered everything I knew. My grandfather, Arthur, had always been my anchor. At 85, he was a picture of health, or so it seemed, until that sudden heart attack stole him from us in his sleep. The funeral was supposed to be a celebration of a life well lived, a final gathering of a loving family to honor the man who had been a pillar of our community. At least, that's what I believed in my heart. The air in the church was heavy with the scent of lilies and the quiet murmur of grief. The pews were packed. Family, friends, neighbors from the quiet cul-de-sac he and Grandma had lived on for 40 years, old colleagues from the factory where he had worked as a skilled machinist for decades, they were all there to pay their respects. My grandmother, Eleanor, stood tall and regal at the front, her back a straight line of unwavering composure. Her face, etched with the fine lines of age and a lifetime of shared memories, was a mask of grief, but her demeanor was one of profound strength. Their 60 years together were the stuff of family legend, a testament to enduring love, loyalty, and commitment that we all looked up to. They were, in my eyes, the living, breathing epitome of what a marriage should be. Towards the end of the service, just as the eulogy concluded and the final hymn began, 3 figures entered the church through the heavy oak doors. Their arrival caused a subtle ripple of curiosity and whispered questions among the mourners. I saw a woman in her late 40s, her face pale and streaked with fresh tears, a man in his early 30s with a rugged, worn look, and a teenage girl who seemed out of place and deeply uncomfortable. I didn't recognize any of them. They weren't among Grandpa's relatives that I knew, and they carried none of the familiar markers of a long-standing friendship. The woman, carrying herself with a fragile mix of determination and sorrow, moved tentatively towards the front pew where Grandma Eleanor sat, her gaze fixed on the casket. A jolt went through me when I saw the storm of emotions that crossed Grandma's face. It wasn't just grief, it was a complex blend of shock, a flash of recognition, and a flicker of pure, unadulterated anger. Her eyes seemed to burn into the woman, silently asking, "What are you doing here? How dare you?" The woman reached Grandma and leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear. Grandma simply nodded, her expression becoming a stony mask once more. In that moment, a knot of deep unease tightened in my stomach. Something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The solemn peace of the funeral was being disturbed by a current of palpable tension that no one else seemed to notice. After the service, as we all filed out into the bright sunlight, this mysterious trio lingered. They didn't join the other mourners who were offering condolences. Instead, they stood to the side, clearly waiting for an opportunity to speak with Grandma. My curiosity, despite the solemnity of the occasion and my own sadness, got the better of me. I watched as Grandma finally approached them and led them to a quiet, secluded corner of the churchyard, partially hidden by an old weeping willow. I edged closer, pretending to comfort a distant relative, all the while straining to catch snippets of their hushed conversation. The woman's voice was thick with tears as she said, "Eleanor, I know this is a terrible time, but my children need to say goodbye to their father." The words hung in the air, a bell tolling with a grim resonance. The word father echoed in my mind, sending a jolt of confusion through me. Whose father? Whose children? Grandpa and Grandma had 2 daughters, my aunts, Margaret and Susan. There were no other siblings, no cousins I didn't know about. So who were these people, and what did they mean? Grandma's reply was hushed but razor-sharp with indignation. "You haven't been a part of our lives for decades, Mary. Why come here now, of all times, and disrupt everything we've built?" The name, Mary, meant nothing to me. It wasn't until later that day, gathered at Grandma's house for the post-funeral family meal, that the truth began to unravel. The atmosphere was thick with a tension so palpable you could almost cut it with a knife, and the food seemed to lose all its flavor. Grandma, who had remained silent and withdrawn throughout the day, finally called me into the living room. "Away from the others, Mia," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she gestured for me to sit. "You've always been the sensible one, the one I can trust with a heavy secret. There's something I need to tell you about your grandfather." We sat across from each other, surrounded by the familiar scent of old books and potpourri. Grandma took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes welling up with a mix of grief and an old, buried pain. "Your grandfather, he had another family. Besides ours. He had a wife and children before he met me. Or, not before me, but parallel to me." The words hit me like a physical blow. The world, as I knew it, tilted on its axis. My perfect, unbreakable family, the one built on 60 years of love and trust, was a lie? A carefully constructed illusion? Grandma's hands, trembling now, moved to the coffee table and placed a worn leather-bound journal in front of me. "I found these in his desk drawer," she said. The journals looked like they spanned Grandpa's entire adult life, filled with his neat, spidery handwriting. There was a woman he met when he was young, a woman named Mary. She was his first love, the one he never got over. They couldn't be together because his family insisted he marry someone suitable, someone from a good family, my family, with our wealth and social standing. But he never truly let her go. He saw her, occasionally, throughout our marriage. They had a son and a daughter. He was their father too, in a world we never knew existed. I felt a profound sense of disorientation. Everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, about their love story, was a fabrication. His perfect life had been a meticulously constructed facade, concealing a parallel existence with another woman and other children. And then, Grandma dropped the final, most crushing bombshell. "You can never tell anyone about this, Mia. Not your father, not your aunts. I don't want to shatter their image of him, of our family. I loved him, faults and all, and I want to take this secret to my grave. He asked me to promise him once that if I ever found out, I would protect his legacy and not let his other life ruin the one he built with me." Now, at 25, I was burdened with a secret that felt heavier than any grief I had ever known. Grandpa's death wasn't the end of a story, it was the explosive beginning of a devastating family drama. The strangers at the funeral were living, breathing proof of Grandpa's hidden life, his secret legacy. And I was caught in the middle, the only one who knew about these two families, these two separate worlds that had collided at his funeral. Could I really keep such a monumental secret? Or did the truth, no matter how painful, deserve to be brought to light? The weight of their expectations, Grandma's desperate plea for silence and the undeniable existence of this other family, pressed down on me, a crushing burden of a truth I was now forced to carry alone. The perfect image of my grandparents' love story had shattered, leaving behind a mosaic of deceit and unanswered questions that threatened to consume everything I thought I knew about my family's history. The implications of this revelation stretched far beyond the immediate shock, hinting at decades of carefully guarded secrets and untold stories that were just beginning to surface, now entrusted to me, the unwilling keeper of this devastating family secret. The journal lay between us, a leather-bound tomb filled with secrets that were now my burden. My grandmother, Eleanor, had left me in the living room, disappearing into the kitchen to prepare tea with a composure that belied the emotional explosion that had just taken place. I sat there, paralyzed, the weight of her words and the sheer audacity of my grandfather's double life crushing me. 60 years. A lie built on 60 years of quiet deception. How could I have been so blind? How could our entire family have been so blind? The perfect love story I had always idealized was nothing more than a fiction, a carefully crafted performance for the world while a real, messy, and forbidden drama played out backstage. The journal's cover was worn smooth, its pages brittle with age. My hand trembled as I opened it to a random entry, a date from my grandfather's early years with Grandma. The handwriting was neat, elegant, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions I was now feeling. The entry described a picnic he had with Mary, his first and only love. He wrote of her laughter, her spirit, the way she understood him in a way Eleanor never could. The words were not those of a simple fling, but of a deep, soul-consuming passion. He expressed his guilt, his profound sadness at having to choose a life of duty over a life of love. He saw his marriage to my grandmother not as a choice of the heart, but as a transaction, a necessary sacrifice to secure his family's prosperity. This was a man I never knew, a man who had lived his entire life in a state of fractured loyalty. As I read more, a pattern emerged. There were entries detailing secret meetings in parks, whispered phone calls when he thought no one was listening, and the desperate, heartbreaking accounts of watching his other children grow up from a distance. One entry from 30 years ago detailed the birth of his son, Mark, the man I'd seen at the funeral. He wrote of his longing to hold him, to be a real father, but of the fear that kept him tethered to his respectable, public life. The journal wasn't a confession of a monster, it was the tortured diary of a man torn between two worlds. It didn't excuse his actions, but it made them, in a terrifying way, understandable. This was not a story of a heartless villain, but of a deeply flawed man trapped by the societal expectations of his time and his own moral failings. The more I read, the more I was consumed by a suffocating sense of injustice. Not just for my grandmother, but for Mary and her children. They had a father who was a ghost, a secret, a series of fleeting moments in their lives. And for my grandmother, it was a different kind of pain. She wasn't just a victim, she was a complicit partner in a lie, choosing to endure this secret life to maintain the facade of a perfect family. When she returned with the tea, her face was serene, a practiced calm that had likely been perfected over decades. "You've read some of it," she said, her voice soft but firm, a statement rather than a question. I closed the journal. "He loved her, Grandma. He loved her deeply. How could you stand it? How could you allow it to go on for so long?" A single, silent tear rolled down her cheek, a crack in the carefully built wall she had erected. "Love is not always enough, Mia. Your grandfather came from a family with a legacy to protect. Mine had money and influence. Our marriage was an arrangement, a stepping stone for his career and a safeguard for my future. I knew there were ghosts in his past, but I never imagined they would have children. I stayed because I loved him, yes, but also because I had nowhere else to go. A woman in my position didn't simply leave. It would have been a scandal. So, I learned to live with the half of him he gave me, and I pretended the other half didn't exist." Her words were like a cold wave crashing over me, washing away the last remnants of my naive beliefs about their marriage. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a deeply complex, societal tragedy. As if on cue, the silence in the room was shattered by the shrill ring of my phone. It was an unknown number. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, with an unshakable certainty, who was on the other end. Reluctantly, I answered. A woman's voice, thick with sorrow and a hesitant politeness, spoke. "Is this Mia?" "My name is Carol. I'm Mary's daughter." My breath caught in my throat. This was the teenage girl I had seen at the funeral, now a grown woman whose voice was filled with a vulnerability that tore at me. "Yes," I managed to say. "I'm so sorry to bother you at a time like this," she continued, her voice trembling. "My brother, Mark, and we have some questions. Our mother has been very unwell since our father passed. She's struggling to handle things. We found a deed to a property in his desk. It's a small cabin by the lake. It was in his name, and his name only. And there's a letter addressed to all of us. It was his last wish that the property be divided among all of his children." My blood ran cold. A deed? A property? The weight on my shoulders suddenly doubled, shifting from a moral dilemma to a legal and financial one. The cabin was a place of cherished family memories for us. We spent summers there, fishing and telling stories. It was part of our family legacy. But it wasn't just ours. Grandpa had left it to all his children, including the ones we never knew existed. Carol explained that the letter was very specific, mentioning his love for all of his children and his wish for them to have a share of a place he held dear. Looked at my grandmother, who was watching me with a look of terrified dread. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she could see the color drain from my face. This was no longer just a secret to be kept, it was an inheritance, a piece of our family's physical history that was now up for grabs. I was the only bridge between these two families, the only one who knew the full truth. The cabin was a piece of my childhood, a part of my family's story. But for them, it was a legacy from a father they barely knew, a final gift he left behind. Now, I was faced with a choice: protect my grandmother and the secret she had kept for decades, or honor my grandfather's final wishes and risk everything, shattering the family I thought I knew and the perfect image of a man I had worshipped my entire life. The phone call ended, but the silence it left behind was 1,000 times louder than the conversation itself. The receiver felt impossibly heavy in my hand. I looked at my grandmother, her face a mask of dawning horror. She hadn't heard the words, but she'd read the implications in my expression. The color had drained from my face, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This was no longer just about a secret. This was about a cabin, an inheritance, a piece of our family's physical history now being claimed by a family we had never known. The truth had found its way out of the grave and was now demanding a seat at our table. "What was that, Mia?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "What did they say?" My own voice was shaky. "He left them the cabin, Grandma. He left it to all his children. He wrote a letter. He wanted it divided among all of them. A gasp escaped her lips, a sound of disbelief and profound betrayal. "No," she said, shaking her head vehemently. "No, he wouldn't. That cabin, that was ours. That was our life, our memories. Your summer vacations, your grandfather teaching you how to fish in that lake, he wouldn't do that to us. It's a lie. They're lying to get their hands on something. They've always been vultures." The bitterness in her voice was a new, ugly sound. It was the sound of a woman whose carefully constructed reality was not just cracking, but shattering completely. I wanted to believe her, to hold on to that image of a grandfather who loved us more than anything, but the journal I had just read told a different story. It was the story of a man who loved fiercely, but also with a divided heart. A man who, in his final moments, might have been trying to atone for a lifetime of deception. "Grandma, I read his journals," I said, my voice gaining a desperate conviction. "He wrote about them. He wrote about his guilt, about his love for them. This isn't a lie. This is a final act from a man who was torn in two his entire life." Her face crumpled. "And so am I," she sobbed, finally letting the tears fall freely. "I was torn in two. I gave him everything, all of my life, and he still couldn't be whole. And now, even in death, he wants to tear my world apart again." I spent the rest of the evening trying to comfort her, but my mind was in turmoil. The moral dilemma had deepened, becoming a tangible, real-world problem. I was now in the middle of a war I had no desire to fight. My grandmother was my flesh and blood, a woman who had suffered in silence for decades. But the other family, Mary and her children, were victims too. They were the collateral damage of my grandfather's choices. Ignoring them, as my grandmother so desperately wanted, would be to compound the injustice. The next day, I made a decision. I had to meet them. I had to see them, to hear their story face to face. I had to understand the other side of this 60-year secret. I texted Carol, the teenage girl from the funeral, and arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small, quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. I didn't tell my grandmother what I was doing. I knew she would try to stop me. Walking into the coffee shop, my heart was a drumbeat in my chest. Carol and her brother, Mark, were already there. They looked nervous, their faces etched with a mix of grief and an unspoken tension that was painfully familiar. They were older versions of the children I'd seen at the funeral, carrying the weight of a shared history I was just now discovering. Mark, with his rugged features and quiet intensity, had his father's eyes, a fact that sent a fresh wave of shock through me. Carol had the same sad grace as her mother, Mary. "Thank you for meeting with us, Mia," Carol said, her voice still a little shaky. "We didn't know who else to turn to. I was the enemy, the person from the other family, and yet they were treating me with a vulnerable kindness that broke my heart." We talked for hours. They didn't come to steal or to cause trouble, they came looking for answers, for closure. They told me about their father, the man they knew only as a kind, gentle presence who would visit them on random weekends, bringing small gifts and a quiet love that always felt rushed and incomplete. He was their secret. They had to pretend he was a family friend, a kind uncle. They had no family dinners, no father to teach them how to ride a bike, no dad at their school plays. His love was a series of carefully planned, secretive encounters. "He always said he would make things right one day," Mark said, his voice thick with a resentment he couldn't quite hide. "He always promised us that one day, he would be our father, openly. But he never did. He just left us the cabin. Like a final consolation prize for a life of being second best." Carol pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was the letter. My grandfather's handwriting was on the envelope, addressed to my children. It was his final, most heartbreaking apology. He wrote of his regret, his shame, his enduring love for both families. He explained that the cabin was his most treasured possession, a place where he found peace. He wanted all of his children to share that peace, to get to know each other, to finally be a family. He was, in his final act, trying to force the two worlds he had so desperately kept apart to merge. I was reeling. My grandfather hadn't just left them a piece of property, he had left me, his trusted confidant, with a mission. He wanted me to be the bridge, to bring these two fractured families together. He was a master of manipulation, even in death, forcing me to clean up his mess. As I left the coffee shop, my head was spinning. I had a choice now, a truly impossible one. I could obey my grandmother, pretend the letter didn't exist, and fight for the cabin. Or I could honor my grandfather's final wishes, not just by giving them the property, but by attempting to bring a fragile, broken family together. The choice wasn't just about land or money. It was about loyalty, justice, and the heavy legacy of a love story that was more fiction than fact. The secrets were out, and now I had to decide if I was going to be the one to finally expose them to the light of day. The silence in the aftermath of my meeting with Carol and Mark was the most profound I had ever experienced. It was the kind of silence that hums with 1,000 unspoken questions, a silence that demands a reckoning. I had a choice to make, but in my heart, I knew there was no choice at all. I couldn't be like my grandparents, living a lie to preserve a fragile peace. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. My grandfather's final wish, his clumsy and deeply flawed attempt at redemption, had put me in an impossible position, but it was a position I had to see through. My grandmother had suffered enough, but so had Mary and her children. To bury this secret now would be to perpetuate the very injustice that had defined so much of their lives. Decided to tell my family everything at our next family dinner, a tradition we held every Sunday. The irony was not lost on me. It was the same table, the same house, where my grandmother had first dropped the bombshell on me. This time, I would be the one holding the match. As I sat there, surrounded by my father, my aunts, and my grandmother, a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. They were all there, a picture of what I had always believed to be a perfect, unbroken family. My father, John, was a mirror image of his father in his kindness and steady nature. My aunts, Margaret and Susan, were boisterous and full of life, their joy a testament to the happy childhood they had supposedly had. And my grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the head of the table, her face pale, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of pleading and warning. She knew what I was about to do. I waited for a lull in the conversation, the moment between the passing of a bowl of mashed potatoes and the pouring of wine. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "There's something I need to tell you all," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. "Something about Grandpa." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me, filled with curiosity and a touch of concern. I took a deep breath and plunged into the story, starting with the funeral and the appearance of the other family. I described my grandmother's confession, the journals, and the heartbreaking meeting with Carol and Mark. I spoke of the cabin, the inheritance, and the letter my grandfather had left, his final attempt to bring his two worlds together. As I spoke, I watched the faces of my family members change, the initial curiosity morphing into shock, then anger, then profound sadness. My father, John, was the first to speak. His face was white. "This is a joke, Mia. It has to be. Dad? A second family? Impossible. He loved Mom more than anything." His words were a desperate denial, a shield against a truth too painful to bear. He looked at my grandmother for confirmation. "Mom, tell them this isn't true." Eleanor just sat there, her head bowed. The silence was her confession. My Aunt Margaret, usually the most cheerful of the family, slammed her fork down on the table. "So you're telling me that all those times Dad said he was working late, or at a fishing tournament, he was with another woman? Another family? Our whole life was a lie? My entire childhood, my memories of him, they're all tainted?" Her voice was choked with fury and heartbreak. My Aunt Susan, always the practical one, was the most concerned about the legal implications. "And this letter? This cabin? The one he built with his own two hands? The place where we spent every summer? He wants us to just give it away to them? To his little side family? That's not a final act of redemption, that's a final act of betrayal. He didn't just betray you, Mom, he betrayed all of us." The dinner table, once a symbol of our unity, became a battlefield. Accusations, tears, and bitter recriminations flew back and forth. My grandmother finally spoke, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I told you, Mia," she said, her eyes burning with a look of betrayal so deep it physically hurt me. "I told you to keep it a secret. I wanted to protect them. But you, my own flesh and blood, you couldn't keep a simple promise." The weight of their collective pain was crushing. I had detonated a bomb in the heart of our family, and the fallout was devastating. My father, the man who had always looked up to his own father with such reverence, was now a broken man, questioning the very foundation of his identity. My aunts, two women who had always felt so secure in their family unit, were now reeling from the discovery that their entire lives had been built on a lie. And my grandmother, she was the silent victim of a 60-year secret, and I had just exposed her to the very pain she had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The next few days were a blur of lawyers, documents, and heated family meetings. My aunts insisted on a full legal review. They wanted to challenge the will, to dismiss the letter as a moment of final, incoherent weakness. The cabin was theirs, they argued. It was part of their inheritance, their birthright. They couldn't, and wouldn't, just hand it over to strangers, however, had the journal and the letter. I had seen the other side of the story, felt the pain of Mary's children. I became the reluctant mediator, the bridge between two families that wanted nothing to do with each other. I tried to explain that the letter wasn't a punishment, but a final plea for reconciliation. But they were too hurt, too angry to listen. The perfect image of their father had been shattered, and they couldn't see anything past the wreckage. My grandmother refused to be a part of any of it. She retreated into herself, a ghost in her own house, her betrayal of me more painful than anything my aunts or father were throwing at me. Her silence was a constant reminder of the promise I had broken, and the cost of my honesty. As the lawyers began to work, I knew that the battle for the cabin was more than just a legal dispute over a piece of land. It was a fight for my grandfather's legacy, a fight for the truth. It was a battle between the perfect lie and the painful reality, and I had unwittingly found myself at the center of the storm. The two families, the two worlds my grandfather had so carefully kept separate for 60 years, were now on a collision course, and I was the only one who could see the full picture, the tragedy, and the love that existed on both sides. The final chapter of my grandfather's life was not a peaceful passing, but a messy, heartbreaking inheritance of secrets that would now forever define the fractured family he left behind. The perfect legacy he so desperately wanted to protect was now in tatters, exposed by the very truth he had tried so hard to bury. The legal battle for the cabin consumed us. It was no longer a fight over a piece of property, it was a war over my grandfather's legacy, a bitter proxy battle for the love and loyalty he had so carelessly divided. The perfect, loving family I had known was now a splintered and resentful group, united only in their fury at the revelation and their desire to hold on to what they believed was theirs. My grandmother, silent and withdrawn, was a ghost in her own home, her pain a constant, suffocating presence. My aunts, Margaret and Susan, saw me not as a granddaughter, but as a traitor who had brought a lifetime of secrets crashing down. My father, John, was lost, grappling with the crushing reality that the man he had idolized was a deeply flawed stranger. The final meeting was set to take place at the lawyer's office. Both sides would be there, my family, bitter and united in their grief, and Mary and her children, Carol and Mark, quiet but resolute. It was a cold, gray morning, and the sterile atmosphere of the law office did nothing to calm my nerves. As I sat in the waiting room, I saw them. Mary, a fragile woman now, sat with her children. She looked older, smaller than she had at the funeral. I felt a surge of empathy for her, a woman who had spent her life as a secret, loving a man who could never fully be hers. Her children, Carol and Mark, carried the same quiet strength I had seen in our first meeting, but it was now tinged with a weariness that broke my heart. The meeting began with a stark formality. My family's lawyer laid out our case, arguing that the letter was not a legally binding will and that the cabin was the rightful inheritance of my grandfather's legal children. He painted Mary and her family as opportunists, seeking to capitalize on a moment of grief. My aunts nodded along, their faces grim. My grandmother sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the floor. It was a brutal, dehumanizing argument, reducing 60 years of life and love to a legal technicality. Then, the lawyer for Mary's family spoke. He was calmer, less aggressive. He presented the letter not as a legal document, but as a moral one, a final plea from a man who wanted to right a lifetime of wrongs. He spoke of Mary's unwavering love for my grandfather, of their children's existence as a silent testament to a deep and enduring bond. He didn't ask for much, only that the families honor my grandfather's last wishes for reconciliation, for all of his children to share in the legacy he left behind. The room was heavy with the weight of both arguments. It was a standoff between a legal truth and a moral truth. As I listened, the full tragedy of the situation washed over me. My grandfather, in his desperate attempt to be a good man to everyone, had ended up hurting everyone. He had tried to be a husband, a father, a provider, a lover, a secret keeper, and in the end, he had failed at it all, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and bitter resentment. Then, something shifted inside me. I looked at my family, a group of people who had been so devastated by this truth they were willing to fight strangers in a courthouse. I looked at Mary's family, strangers who were just as broken and deserving. And I realized that the fight for the cabin was never the point. The point was to finally bring this secret into the light and to heal, not to wound. I stood up, my voice trembling but firm. I don't think we need to fight over this, I said, my words cutting through the tense silence. Everyone in the room turned to me, shocked. My grandmother's eyes finally met mine, a flicker of panic in their depths. This isn't about the cabin. It's about Grandpa. He loved all of us, in his own way. He was a flawed man, and he made a lot of mistakes. But in the end, he wanted to do the right thing. He wanted us to be a family, not two separate ones at war with each other. I turned to my aunts. Think about the summers we spent at that cabin. It was a place of joy, right? A place of family. Maybe that's what he wanted for his other children too. He wanted them to have a place of peace, a place where they could feel a part of something, a place where their father's legacy was not a secret, but a shared memory. Then, I turned to Mary and her children. He may have failed you in life, but I believe his last wish was to finally give you a piece of his world. And that's all he had to give. My words hung in the air. The lawyers looked stunned. My aunts were speechless. My father just stared at me, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. And then, my grandmother, the woman who had carried this secret for decades, finally spoke. She's right, she said, her voice barely audible. He loved that cabin more than anything. It was his sanctuary. It was the only thing he felt he truly owned, the only place he felt he could be whole. He gave it to his children to try and make them whole. We should honor that. The tension in the room broke. My grandmother's words were a surrender, not to Mary's family, but to the truth. She was finally letting go of the lie she had protected for 60 years. The lawyers, seeing the shift in the room, began to talk of a settlement. The cabin would be sold, and the proceeds would be divided among all the children, including my aunts, Carol and Mark. It was a compromise that no one was happy with, but it was a resolution that everyone could live with. The legal battle ended, but the family drama was far from over. The wound was deep, and it would take years to heal. My relationship with my grandmother was never the same. We had found a new, quiet respect for each other, but the easy warmth was gone, replaced by the understanding of two people who had seen the worst in a man they had both loved. My father slowly began to accept the truth, finding a new way to remember his father, not as a perfect man, but as a complicated one. And my aunts, they took the money and, for a time, kept their distance. I, however, found an unexpected connection. Carol and Mark, in their own time, reached out to me. We didn't talk much about the cabin or the legal battles. We talked about their father. We shared stories and memories of the same man, from two different worlds. We pieced together the puzzle of his life, a life that was both tragic and beautiful in its complexity. We discovered that we had more in common than we had ever thought, and why grandfather's secret had shattered my perfect world, but it had also, in a strange and heartbreaking way, created a new one. The family I knew was broken, but in its place, a new, wider family had emerged. A family bound not by the pretense of perfection, but by the shared, messy, and undeniable truth of a deeply flawed man's life. The story was not about a perfect marriage, but about the long, difficult road to reconciliation, a journey that had only just begun.